today and for the next few weeks, we're going to look at some of the stories that Jesus told and some of the stories about Jesus. And we'll look at them and find out what we can learn from those stories that we can apply in our own lives. And one of the most favorite stories that is told is the story of the Prodigal Son. It is a story that Jesus told in the book of Luke, and it follows two other short stories that he told in response to the Pharisees challenging him because he was willing to hang out with sinners and he was willing to eat with them. As I said, the story of the Prodigal Son is one of those most popular stories that are shared about the teachings of Jesus. And yet I have found it to be one of the most confusing stories. So here we are, going to talk about it today. I mentioned that Jesus told this story in the book of Luke, following two other stories. Luke chapter 15. The first one is called the Parable of the Lost Sheep, in which Jesus talks about how important one single sheep is, and how a good shepherd will leave 99 of his sheep that are safe and go and find one lost sheep. He follows that with another story about the lost coins, and how a woman who has lost one out of her 10 coins will shine a light and sweep the floor until she finds her lost coin. In both cases, once they've found their lost item, the sheep or the coin, they gather their friends and their neighbors and they have a party, a celebration. And then following these two stories, which take a total of 10 verses, Jesus talks about the prodigal son. That story in itself is 20 verses long, longer than the other two stories combined, and it goes into a fair amount of detail. It differs from the other two stories in a couple of really important ways. The first is that the person who is lost comes and finds himself. And that perhaps makes it the most noticeable difference between the stories. So I know it's quite a long story, and I will try and read quickly. But it is important, I think, to get a sense of the story. So Luke chapter 15, verse 11, starting at 11. And Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided the property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of the country. who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare? And here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to the slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field. And when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. The slave replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him home, back safe and sound.' The brother. Then he became angry and refused to go in. The father came out and began to plead with him, but he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me even a young goat so I might celebrate with my friends. But when the son of yours came back who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" So what do we see in this story? We see this progression in this entire chapter from one sheep in 100, one coin out of 10, one brother out of 2. They all speak to the importance of each individual and the awareness that we should never give up on those who we consider a lost cause. There's always hope, and when we return to our wholeness, there is cause for celebration. And so, for many, that powerful message rests right there, that it's never too late for redemption. That when we turn back, when we repent, there will be celebration and new life. But what else can we learn from this story? As I mentioned, the difference between this and the coins and the sheep is that this is involving a lost human. The sheep wanders off. The coin is lost. This human chooses to go on a journey. The shepherd looks for the sheep. The woman looks for her lost coin. The father does not look for the son. He waits. And because we're speaking about humans, and we have the complication of two brothers, it has a more emotional impact. And what does it mean? Well, with metaphysical interpretation, that we look beyond the physical and we treat the people, the places, the events, the aspects of stories as aspects of ourselves. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to use the word "in me" after the name or the event or the place. We realize as we read the story that we have all of those characters within us. And there are times when we play each of the roles. And so today I'd like to break the story into 3 segments. The 3 segments are the prodigal son, also known as the sinner, the Paragon son, also known as the saint, and their father, also known as the wisdom and love of God, the wisdom and love that is in each of us. Excuse me. The prodigal son. The word prodigal comes from the Latin prodigus, which means lavish. Prodigal means spending money or resources freely and recklessly, wastefully extravagant. A person who spends in a recklessly extravagant way. So this prodigal son takes all of this wealth that he's been given, and he takes all of his possessions and he goes to another country. See ya. Be nice knowing you. I'm going to go and figure it out myself. And while he's there, he parties it up. What we might say today is, wine, women, and song. And eventually he runs out of money. He runs out of resources. And it says that there is a famine in the country. In desperation, then, he turns to becoming a worker, to becoming a slave to the things that he would otherwise have considered abhorrent. He realizes that he has hit bottom, and he comes to himself. And then he says to himself, I'm going to go home. In humility, I am going home, prepared to work as a hired hand to his father. Can we see ourselves in this story? Sure. Haven't we all at times had a restless longing for excitement, to be fulfilled by outer sense stuff? It might be wine, women, and song. It could be any kind of addiction. We turn to things outside of ourselves to bring us joy. Lost to overwork, to alcohol, to drugs, to gambling, to sex, to spending, to eating, to watching television, to binging on Netflix. And at some point, we realize that that's not doing it for us anymore. Internally, we may find that we're using our resources and wasting it on things that give us a bit of a charge, like anger and gossip and disgruntlement and hate. And all of those things deplete us. And when we become depleted, we enter this emotional land of famine, a wasteland where we end up, instead of enjoying these things, becoming enslaved to them. So instead of us knowing where the boundaries are, it's like those things have us. And there is no joy in it. There is no joy in it. And if we are wise, if we are self-aware, if we are courageous, we come to a point where we hit bottom, where we come to ourselves and recognize that we need to do something different. And so in humility, we turn back towards the place of wholeness within us, returning to our Father. Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." The meek. The person who is willing to be open enough to admit that they are wrong, that they have done something that has not worked. And so, are we willing enough to be humble when we recognize that there is a behavior or a habit or an addiction or an outward focus that no longer serves us? And are we willing to look within, come to ourselves, and go back to our home? Many of us, had we been that prodigal son, would never have admitted that. I would rather die than admit that I made a mistake and go back home. This story is about courage, about authenticity. When we do return, we find ourselves restored. New coat, new shoes, transformed. That one is the easy one to understand. Lost my clicker. Let's look at the other son. The paragon of virtue. This is the guy who's the responsible one, who was working in the fields for his dad while his reckless younger brother took off. And then there's no party for him. And he quite understandably gets upset when his father makes this big fuss over someone that he doesn't think deserves it. Have you ever been in that position? Where someone has been a bad boy, a bad girl, and then when they do come back, it's all this celebration and all this focus, and the guy who's been, or the girl who's been there the whole time and constantly just plodding along is essentially ignored. Of course, we're all of these characters all of the time, some of the time, but they're all within us. According to this dictionary, the paragon, what I consider the saint, is a person or thing regarded as a perfect example of a particular quality. So this son was the perfect example of sonness. At least that's how it's portrayed. And maybe it's more interesting that that's how he probably saw himself. I am the good brother, the responsible one. Me, personally, I am the good daughter, the responsible one. I'm the eldest of 5. The older always seems to be the more responsible one. It seems inherently unfair, doesn't it? Why is there so much focus on Prodigal Son and so little focus on the Paragon Son, on the good guy? Why is it told like this? And why is there so much detail? To the detail right down to the fact that he doesn't go and ask his dad what the party is about. He goes and asks one of the slaves what's going on. Like, there's a lot of information in this story. Here's my interpretation. The Paragon Son represents the things that we do from a place of fog. Fear, obligation, and guilt. Think about it. If he had chosen to stay with his dad and work the farm or the fields completely of his own free will, with no expectation of anything, simply because it was what he wanted to do, then he would have had no trouble being excited to see his returning brother. He would have had no trouble celebrating his sibling and the success and the growth of his sibling. To me, the fact that he was resentful is an indication that there was a part of him that expected something because he was being the good one. He represents that part of ourselves that does things for show or for a payoff. That part of ourselves that is secretly, and sometimes not so secretly, quite judgmental, self-righteous. Look at me, I am perfect, I am doing it all right. Look at what a good boy I am. When we operate with a hidden agenda, including the agenda of look at me and how perfect I am and what a good person I am, We're secretly hoping for a payoff. And that means that we will find ourselves easily offended. We will feel resentment when someone else is celebrated. In many ways, that Paragon Son represents the part of us that goes through the motions, expecting a reward. So as we go forward and question these parts of ourselves, we can recognize that sometimes we're the prodigal and we can remember to come home. And sometimes we're the paragon. We're setting ourselves up to be the virtuous one, to be the one to be looked at and applauded. And it is a good insight to be aware of when we find ourselves judgmental, when we find ourselves offended, to recognize that we are setting ourselves up to be higher or lesser than other people. And that brings us to the Father. The Father represents the highest part of ourselves. The Father represents the unconditional acceptance of all of us. The unconditional love and joy and wanting the good for all of us, for all aspects of us. And so when we find a habit that no longer serves us and we turn it around, the Father part of us celebrates. The Father accepts both sons right where they are. The Father did not say, no, you shouldn't take that money. You're going to blow it. Don't do it. You notice that the Father did not in any way try to control. And the Father didn't say, I told you so. Instead, he trusted that the Son had learned something and was now at a higher level of consciousness, more ready to be fulfilled. The Father part of us is encouraged not to beat ourselves up, proverbially, not to say, oh, I shouldn't have, or I told you so, or you don't deserve. When prodigal parts of ourselves act out, and they do. The Father part of ourselves doesn't say to the parts that are working, hey, stop. It just invites acceptance of all. Because when we celebrate all, it raises the entire family. The goal for us from this story is to assume the role of the Father when we see ourselves in the role of the prodigal or the role of the paragon. We celebrate the wins, always. We create safety. We love unconditionally. Let's take this into a time of quiet meditation. As we reflect on the wisdom in this story, we think of the times when we are the prodigal son, the aspects of ourselves that want to act out, the parts of ourselves that use our energy for things that eventually can enslave us. What part of myself have I allowed to become depleted? And where can I come back to myself and turn back home? What aspects of myself show up as the older brother, the righteous one, the paragon of virtue? Where am I judgmental? Where am I seeking approval? Doing what is expected out of fear, out of obligation, out of guilt? Am I willing to release my attachment and come home to be part of the celebration? Can I, as the father of my thoughts, be open and kind and loving to all the aspects of me? I am love. I am acceptance. I am forgiveness. And it is the Father's joy to give me keys to the kingdom